In addition to analyzing standing and gait, we might think about sitting here. Sitting is so ubiquitous these days. Chairs have a lot to answer for in terms of problems that they give to structure. And then again, we're not trained in how to sit on them. So let's look a little bit on balanced sitting. Sitting should be the same spinal arrangement as standing. It's just that instead of the weight coming up through the hip joint from the head of the femur into the acetabulum, it comes from the sits bone. But the sits bone, at least where you sit on the sits bone, should be just about the same, on the same line as the head of the femur, and then sitting will be easy and not strenuous. Since we have Marco sitting this way, if we look at left and right sitting, the thing that makes a difference, and that we haven't already covered in the standing gait assessment, is where the sits bones land and where the body lands on the sits bone. One way to test this that I wanted you to see from the front is to have Marco go up on this cheek, but you're actually going up on this sits bone, yeah? Mm-hmm. So you take the other one off, and then come over onto this one. Now, I don't know if you can see the difference, but when he goes this way, he goes straight to the right. When he comes on to the left, I'm going to exaggerate, rotates around this way. Can you feel that difference? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this feels one way, and this feels another. And your client will be able to feel that on the sits bone itself. Don't you feel a difference in how you're running up on this one? And when you get over here, you kind of fall to the outside, don't you? Yep. So he's not coming down equally on the two sits bones. So let's just run you around this way till you see your back to the camera. Yeah, all the way around. And then I'd just like you to see this again. Remember, we saw, if you remember back to when we were doing standing assessment with Marco, we saw that his pelvis was not horizontal, and here we see it represented in sitting. Here he goes up on top of the sits bone. Here he falls off the sits bone. Can you see that difference? Just do it a couple more times so that the folks in TV land there can have a couple of times to see this. So he's not exaggerating what happens when he goes over to the left. This is what happens when he comes up on those two. This would give an indication to me. I'm not going to show you work. There's all kinds of ways in which we might address this, but his sacroiliac joint and the angle of his hip bone here is different, angled more in on his left and angled more straight up and down on his right. So that's one bit with sitting. Now, if we can get you to come back so you face away from me on the squeaky stool. And here we can see somebody sitting. In terms of the left-right, we really saw a difference with Marco. But with the front-back, this is a really good example of correct sitting. And we can check this by seeing what happens if we go into an anterior and a posterior tilt. So, Marco, if you go into an anterior tilt and it arches his back, and if he goes into a posterior tilt and it rounds his back, and then he comes back to normal. You just come back to wherever feels normal to you. The angle in sitting that we would like is where, again, as I said, the sitting looks just pretty much like standing. And you can play with your client's pelvic position as being the sine qua non, the key to sitting. A lot of folks, when they sit down, allow themselves to come onto the sits bone, the back rounds, and they lean against the back of the chair, or they lean onto the ligaments in the back in that kind of slump. Now, your mom said, okay, lift your chest up. Now, whoops, without moving your pelvis, lift your chest up. This is such an unsuccessful strategy to make for better sitting. So let that fall, and instead roll onto the front of the pelvis. Okay? And if you roll so far onto the front of the pelvis, you'll find that the back is hyperextending. That doesn't look like a great standing posture either. So he comes back to being right on top. If I were to diagram the sits bones and the bottom of the pelvis, it's a kind of two triangles like this, and you could rock back onto the tailbone or rock forward onto the pubic bone. If you rock forward onto the pubic bone, you're going to make a very arched back and feel compressed back here in the lumbars. If you rock back onto the tailbone, you're going to make a rounded back and lose the support for the chest coming down here. So never mind what your mom said, just roll forward on your pelvis until you can see it in the camera, but we'd have to get it as a feeling in the client. The pelvis is under the rib cage, is under the head. That's the kind of sitting which, once you get used to it, takes a little getting used to, but once you get used to it, you can sit there for hours and hours without getting tired. It's not sitting per se that's the problem, it's the way the chairs are constructed and what they do to us that makes the problem. At this point in the tape, we'd like to spend a little time with breathing, and there are as many ways that people will tell you to breathe as there are schools, I suppose, but we're just going to do a few basics in terms of a full and complete breath, and we'll sit with Marco here to see a couple of them. The first thing is the rib cage is a box, and to have the box work as something that sucks air in and then pushes it in, it's got 6 sides, and the sides have to expand. So there's 2 sides, a front and a back side, and a top and a bottom facet to the cube. Now, the bottom one is the diaphragm moving down. And if you're a Pilates teacher, and you can argue with the yoga teachers and the Zen people as to whether how far the diaphragm should go down and what should happen to the belly when it goes down. So I freely admit that what I'm about to say is a set of my opinions that I've gathered along the way from teaching with a bunch of people, and I think if you just learn to observe, you can put your own parameters in there, but I'm going to use mine to help you see different bits of the breathing. The first thing is the up and the down part. If you put your hands right here, there's the trapezius, and there's the scalenes. You just go along the side of the neck very gently. You're not pressing in, because if you do, it'll feel like you're choking somebody. And Marco takes a deep breath. I will feel when the scalenes come in. The scalenes are the part that pull the box up, and they're right here between the just turn your head to the side, between the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius. If you put your fingers, come on back, in there are the scalenes. And the scalenes should be active. In my world, it's ideal if they're active throughout the breath, as they are with Marco. If you watch my fingers, I don't know if you can see it on the video, but as soon as he breathes, he pushes my fingers out with the scalenes, and they're active all through the breath. Other people won't use the scalenes until the very top of the breath, and some people won't seem to use the scalenes at all, but instead of not seeming to use them, they're just hanging on to them tight through the whole breath. So the best is the scalenes get used through the whole breath. Next best is they get used at the top of the breath to pull that top rib up. Worst best is that they don't get used at all. The diaphragm coming down will often, especially in a seated posture as we are now, result in the belly coming forward and out as the intra-abdominal pressure increases. That's pretty well standard issue for the meditative practices, for Buddhism, for Tai Chi. And other people have a difference of opinion that when you breathe in, the belly should actually fall back. I don't have an opinion about that, although I think I fall down on the belly should go forward, folks. But now, if we get you to turn to the side again, here's the part that I really think is more important, because you can breathe, and I'm going to encourage you to do this one, Marco. I can breathe down into the belly such that the belly goes forward and the low back go forward. Yeah? You feel that? It's like really breathing into your belly cavity, and the diaphragm goes down, belly goes forward, and the lower back arches a little bit. I'm really recommending against that form of belly breathing. So I'm going to encourage Marco to not only have this hand go forward, but to have this hand go back. So I'm surmising. Let's see if I can put this properly without offending anybody. I wonder if the lumbars might not come back on an in-breath and then relax forward, relax into hyperextension on the out-breath. That would mean that in the belly, in breathing, my two hands were ever so slightly going this way apart from each other on the in-breath and back toward each other on the out-breath. What we don't want to see is lumbar hyperextension on the in-breath and then relax. If anything, we're looking for a slight lumbar flexion. In other words, these guys coming back on the in-breath. So it's a worthwhile kind of little meditation to put your hand here and here and encourage the client. Can you push my hands apart from each other? And he's having fun with it, but the lumbars aren't yet coming back in the breath so much. Okay? That's one thing you can look at. The second bit in terms of front to back breathing, and this is the hardest movement of all three to get, which is spreading my two hands up here in the chest. We already talked about how Marco has a limitation here, and he's going right past that limitation with his deep breath. To push, I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but to push my front hand forward on his in-breath. Can you see my front hand going forward on the in-breath? I can feel it going forward. And Marco, we'll come to the same idea. Can you also push my back hand back? Yeah. Okay, that's... Given that we said that he had a restriction in his diaphragm before, he's really got a lot of movement available in here, more than I expected to find, because he is indeed pushing my front hand forward and my back hand back on the breath. And that's what I would like to see in this front-back balance of the breath. And now if we get you to turn back towards the camera. The third dimension of breathing, or a third dimension of breathing, is the side to side. And you can do this in three positions with your hands to encourage, to assess the breathing, but in assessing it, you encourage it. If I take my hands and put the heels of my hands in, up under the ribs, where the heels of my hands are in back, are the floating ribs. So as he breathes, I feel whether the floating ribs are floating up and forward on the in-breath or up and back on the in-breath. And as you can tell from the tone of my voice, up and back is to be preferred. Like the wings of a bird opening into your hand, can you feel these floating ribs coming back? As with the lumbars, this is particularly a difficult move for Marco. However, what I can feel is the second position of my hands, which would be around these so-called abdominal ribs, 6, 7, 8, and 9, above the floating ribs, and I think you can see quite clearly that using the what's called the bucket handle effect in anatomy, he is spreading my hands apart on the in-breath, and indeed my hands are falling down and together on the out-breath. That's great. And thirdly, a lot of folks don't use the ribs under the armpits. So if you lay, just put your arm up so they can see, if you lay your hand so that the fingertips rest at the top of the armpit, this side too, yep. And then I slide my hands up just a little bit so I'm on the highest rib that I can get, and before I would say anything, of course he's going to hear me when I say it, but I first would just assess whether there is any movement here, and then, depending on what I feel, I could wiggle my fingers a little bit. Don't press too hard in here, it's delicate. But I could draw his attention to the spreading of the upper ribs, which is moving very nicely in Marco's body. Perhaps you can see his shoulders moving and my hands moving. A quick way to work with that in terms of the shoulders and the breath, what would I like to see the shoulders doing on a proper breath? What we would like to see is what we see with Marco. Watch my fingers. When he breathes in right now, my fingers move up and apart from each other a little bit, and down and in on the exhale. That is the desired motion of the shoulder in terms of shoulder position for breathing, is that the shoulders can slide on the rib cage, but the rib cage is moving out, so they end up moving out and up a little bit on the in-breath and down and in on the out-breath. If they move straight up on the in-breath and straight down on the out-breath, you will find that they are pretty much hung up on the rib cage. The muscles that hold the shoulder girdle to the rib cage, rhomboids, pectoralis minor, serratus, anterior, are likely to be locked down and keeping the shoulders so in sync with the rib cage that they move straight up and straight down with the rib cage. If, by contrast, you ask somebody to breathe and they don't move at all, the shoulders never move, then those shoulders are too hung off the neck, and you will find that the trapezius, levator scapulae, and maybe even the sternocleidomastoid are fastened down and not responding at all to the breath. This is a quick primer on breathing of the most obvious kind. Just looking at this box, do the sides move, top, middle, bottom? Does the front move away from the back and the back move away from the front in the chest and in the belly? And are the scalenes moving and the diaphragm moving in the bottom? I can tell you that the diaphragm will be moving. It can be restricted, but when you're winded, if you've ever been hit here and felt that awful feeling of not being able to breathe, that's when your diaphragm isn't working. So you can be sure that anybody who's breathing, their diaphragm is working. It is the primary muscle of breathing. What we're looking at are these accessory movements around it, and the accessory movements of breathing might not be necessary to get the oxygen in and out of your lungs, but they're necessary to keep your spine healthy, your ribs healthy, the organs nourished and hydrated, and circulation. So it's a good thing to assess. Okay, so in addition to assessing the standing posture and gait, we want to do a little bit of assessment here on sitting. Now, chairs have a lot to answer for in this world. But it's not really the chairs per se, it's how we use them and the design of the chairs that tend to send us into not great postural things. If we look at sitting here, in fact, what I'm going to do with Karen is turn you around so that you're side. If you look at how the line goes up the body from sitting, it's really from the hip up, the same as standing. The spine should be in the same relation and the head should be in the same relationship as in standing, except that the weight is coming up from the sits bone through the spine rather than from the head of the femur. So what you want to do is orient the body so that the sits bone is underneath the femoral head if you want to have easy upright sitting. Unfortunately, what happens is people roll pelvis posterior onto the tailbone. So if you let your pelvis roll back onto the tailbone, you can see how that creates a collapse of the chest, a compression of the spine, the head goes forward. Seen that before? Yup. Every teenager in the whole land collapses to where they are leaning. This is, if you want to know, leaning on your posterior longitudinal ligament in the spine. Now, the thing that your mother does from here is say, pick your chest up and sit up straight. That is not the solution to this problem. The solution to this comes in the pelvis. So roll on slowly onto your pelvis until you feel that place where it feels easy and upright. Now, that easy place may not be so easy when somebody first gets there because the muscles have to be retrained a little bit. But you can see how the pelvis, the chest, and the head are lined up with each other. And you can see how if she drops back onto the back of the pelvis, that alignment goes away and the collapse sets in. And it's actually harder work to sit this way than it is the other way, but try convincing any teenager of that. Now, by the way, you can go too far the other way. Like a horsewoman, if you go way onto the front of your pelvis, you will see that, see where my fingertips are going into her back. She's really got a posterior bend or a lordosis in the back, and that gets the chest way up, but it does it at the cost of the back. We saw that a few times in the standing posture. So roll back onto your pelvis until you get to here. Good. That is the front-back thing on sitting, is where is the pelvis horizontal for sitting? Again, we use a functional definition, not a geometric definition of it's horizontal when this and this. It is horizontal when the pressure on the sits bones or the ischial ramus, the bone that you're sitting on, is about at the same place that the head of the acetabulum is, and the spine and the head sit in the same kind of upright posture that they would in standing. Now, if we can get you, Karen, to just move a little bit around again so your back is to the camera. Now, side to side on sitting can be instructive too. So if I get you to lean over so you're on one cheek, just keep your head fairly horizontal, and then come up on the other side. Now, do those feel the same to you?
This feels easier, actually.
So it's easier for her to go up on the right side.
Yeah.
And a little harder on her left side. Now, if we look at this, you can see that this may be a little hard on the camera, but I'll tell you, this sits bone is wider away from the midline, and this one is tucked in towards the midline. The two hip bones are slightly different in the pelvis. Let me stay out of the way here. When she comes onto the left one, she really has to compensate with the upper body. When she comes onto the right one, she pretty much stays over that sits bone. This is a good assessment tool for seeing which side of the hip is better at carrying the weight in sitting. And although we're not doing work in this program, you can find many ways to work with the skeleton or with the soft tissue. And even doing this exercise over and over again, the assessment tool becomes a treatment because it's getting a little easier going up on that left side, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I can feel that. So some of it's just habit and learning. Some of it might be the structure of the body. It's something that you can experiment with to see. But since we spend so much of the time sitting in cars in front of computers, there are various things that you can do to help this, like getting wedge pillows or lumbar support pillows. I'm in support of all of those things, but don't neglect the idea of educating your client into where they are sitting properly so that they have some idea of where to come back to. Okay, so assessing breathing is a complex thing because there are so many theories about how one should breathe. There are probably as many theories as there are schools of yoga and Pilates and breathing in general. So we'll just stick to some very basic things here that are, on the most basic biomechanical level, the rib cage is a box. And if you look at this box over here, you'll see that the box, if we turn this round thing into a box, it has two sides, a front and a back side, and a top and a bottom side. And ideally, as you bring air into the body, you would open up all of these dimensions of the box. Nobody will fail to have the diaphragm going down. That part of opening the box is guaranteed to be there because if you've ever been winded, if you've ever had the wind knocked out of you by somebody hitting you or landing on your belly, you know what it's like to try to breathe without your diaphragm. It's really not a successful thing. So your other muscles of breathing are definitely secondary or tertiary compared to the diaphragm, which is always that box is going down. Now, what happens to the belly when that box goes down, when that side of the box goes down, is open to question. Some people say that the belly should fall back on the inhale and forward on the exhale. Some folks say that the belly should go forward on the inhale and drop back on the exhale. I don't know. You can pays your money and takes your choice as to whatever school you belong to. But it's worth looking and assessing to see what's happening by your own lights in terms of the breathing. I think I have to fall with the belly goes forward idea on that. In fact, let's turn you to the side to get to this thing. If the belly goes forward on the in-breath, because you're filling the increasing intra-abdominal pressure by bringing the diaphragm down, then at the same time, we would hope that the lumbars come back a little bit on the in-breath. So not only do I want to see this hand go forward, I want to see this hand come back on the in-breath. So drop your breath right down into your belly and see what happens. Getting a little bit of motion in the lumbars there. What I don't want to see happen, and this is the kind of breathing into the belly that I would definitely correct if I assessed it this way, is that when Karen breathes in, the belly goes forward and the lower back goes forward. In other words, she leans back or has a posterior tilt in her rib cage when she breathes in, or, as we said in our language, a posterior bend in the lumbar. So having the belly go out and the lumbars go forward is really not a good way to breathe. In my opinion, but it's only an opinion, the best way is that when she breathes in, both hands in the belly go apart. That indicates that the lumbars are soft and pliable and movable, and that the belly is movable, and that the diaphragm is taking its full excursion down. All right, if we can get you to turn back to the camera, we can go to the top of the box. The top of the box is the scalenes, and I can find the scalenes just by putting my fingers in between the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid, and as Karen breathes, I wait for these scalenes. They don't quite contract like muscles, they just kind of get hard. They go from slightly soft pieces of steel to slightly harder pieces of steel in most people. You want those scalenes to be working. They're actually the second muscles of breathing, and the intercostals might be the third muscles of breathing. So I feel the scalenes working through most of Karen's breath. In a very well-trained person, in my opinion, the scalenes work throughout the entire breath. They start right in at the beginning and go to the end. And in other people's, less trained in my experience, they use the scalenes only at the top of the breath to lift that top rib up. Okay, so that's the top and the bottom of the box. What about the sides of the box? Well, if I put my hands around Karen's rib cage and I take the heel of, just turn this way a little bit, turn your whole self this way, feet too. I can put my hands against her rib cage with my fingers coming around front, but the heels of my hands are up against those floating ribs. So then when she breathes, I can feel what are those floating ribs doing. In the best of all possible worlds, those floating ribs would come back and up into my hands like the unfolding wings of a bird. And that's a consummation devoutly to be wished for Karen's breathing. Maybe next time. However, if I move my hands up onto the abdominal ribs, ribs 6, 7, 8, and 9, then she takes a breath. I definitely feel those very strongly moving in the bucket handle motion of these ribs coming up and moving out as they come up like a bucket handle. That Karen has very strongly. Thirdly, I could put my hands into the armpits. Now drop your shoulders over my hands very gently, just to give a reminder to her upper ribs that they too can move under the shoulders. Okay, just turn and face the camera again if you would. Which brings us to the shoulders, and what should the shoulders do in breathing? And by my lights, I would hope for this with the shoulders, that when she breathes in, that the shoulders widen and lift on the inhale and drop down and in on the exhale. Yeah. If the shoulders are riding on the rib cage and gliding on the rib cage, they are lifted by the ribs, but they slide to the outside. If they're really held to the rib cage by the pectoralis minor and the serratus anterior, etc., then they will go straight up and straight down with the rib cage. So if you see that kind of motion when somebody takes a deep breath, you can be pretty sure that they're too tied to the rib cage. If, on the other hand, you see no motion of the shoulders when they breathe and nothing happens with the shoulders, you can be pretty sure that the shoulders are hung off the neck. The trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid and levator scapulae are so tight that it's hanging like a coat hanger off the neck and not even being moved by the rib cage. That leaves us with, finally, if I can get you to turn to the left again, the motion front to back. We already talked about the motion front and back down here as a result of the motion of the diaphragm, but what we haven't talked about yet is this motion here. So if Karen takes a deep breath, do I feel my hands moving apart from each other? You're going to get a few possibilities here. Either the front hand is going to move away from the back hand, but the back hand isn't going to move at all. The back hand's going to move away from the front hand, but the front hand isn't going to move at all. Or neither hand is going to move, and I'm afraid that that's a common enough occurrence, is that people don't get any depth change from front to back. However, if you watch my fingers as Karen breathes, you'll see my front finger move away from my back finger. but you won't see the response in the back of the back moving back, even though she's looking for it. I can feel it. But the consummation devoutly to be wished, what we'd like to see with breathing, again, as we'd like to see it with the lumbars and the belly moving away from each other, we'd like to see the thoracics and the sternum moving away from each other on the in-breath, falling back together on the out-breath. You don't see this very often. But if the best thing would be that both sides move away from the midline and back down in. If you assess for these kinds of movements in breathing, you can do all kinds of work, whether it be movement work or breathing work or manipulative work, to help open up these various dimensions of breathing in people and thus make the massage of the organs, the circulation. I don't think you need all these motions to get oxygen in and out of there, because that's not really the core of the meaning of breathing. The meaning of breathing in your body is to create movement. So the more that we can have that movement spreading out into the body, thus I'm theorizing, the healthier the body will be.